So this library summer school is about the only place where you're going to see me like this. So it's an exclusive performance for you, and it's a view into the past and into the future. We start with my previous work, and certainly we're living in a complex world. It's so complex that actually technology doesn't work. Okay. Here we go. So there are many examples, of course, of complex systems. And we know it from turbulent fluids, from traffic flows, supply chains, social, political, economic, ecological systems. Our body is all complex systems. And it's very exciting, very interesting for scientists, and there is a known field, complexity science. And complexity science has started quite theoretical. I don't know why it's so difficult really to switch this forward. So, for example, people got excited about fractals, and they got excited about bifurcation diagrams, logistic map, and so on. And here we go, and into chaotic attractors and all this. I'm not going to explain this again. I assume you would know about it, or if you were interested, you would learn about it. Now, one important point about many of those complex systems is their limits of predictability. We know this actually from weather forecasts. Even though it's working pretty well over a few days, over long time periods, it doesn't work. And this has some reasons. It's actually the physics behind it that causes that kind of situation.
Was the first person to demonstrate that a combination of variables can be used to distinguish flow into two types, laminar and turbulent. Using dimensional analysis, you can find a common relationship between the characteristic length, velocity, density, and viscosity of the fluid being tested. These parameters combined make Reynolds number. Reynolds number is equal to the density times the velocity times the characteristic length over the viscosity of the fluid. Its significance is the ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces on a fluid element. When Reynolds number is less than an order of magnitude of 10 to the third, fluid flow is characterized as being laminar. In this type of fluid flow, viscous forces dominate inertial forces. Variations in velocity in laminar flow are smooth and predictable. Streamlines are parallel to one another, allowing for precise calculations and models to be made. When Reynolds number is greater than an order of magnitude of 10 to the fourth, fluid flow is characterized as being turbulent. This type of flow is dominated by inertial forces.
Like this. And we find very similar flows also among flocks of birds and among even herds of animals and these kind of things. So this brings us basically to swarm intelligence and collective behavior. So, but how to distinguish complex from complicated systems? A car is a complicated system. It's made up of many pieces, but it's well controllable. You need a steering wheel, a gas pedal, a braking pedal, and that's about it, and you can control it more or less perfectly. However, if many cars interact with each other and adapt to each other, what happens is a complex dynamics, stop and go, traffic, and other kinds of congestion and this is actually then a complex system that is not well controllable. Complex systems are a daunting class of problems. So, characterized by a large number of interacting system elements, they're nonlinear or network interactions. There's typically a rich system behavior. They behave dynamic rather than static, probabilistic in many cases rather than deterministic, and often show surprising or even paradoxical behavior. For example, slower is faster effects. I will show you some examples for this. They're sometimes hardly predictable, sometimes seemingly uncontrollable, and they challenge our common way of thinking. It's almost everywhere around us, and they're basically a nightmare for politicians and other decision makers. So let's take phantom traffic jams as an example. Nobody wants this, but it happens every single day. At least when the density is above a critical threshold, then very small variations in the speed will be amplified. There will be a domino effect. The next driver will over-brake a little bit, and the next driver will brake even harder, and so eventually drivers get stopped even though they would like to avoid that. So altogether that creates a phantom traffic jam because there's no reason like an accident or a building site or something like this, right? So complex systems are systems where we observe a failure of linear thinking, top-down control often doesn't work, and many other ways of traditional control don't work. And today, of course, we're living in a highly networked world, and that has the implication that the intended effects don't always happen. In many cases there will be side effects, there will be feedback effects, or there will be cascading effects. And in fact, many of the big unsolved problems of the world result from such kind of systemic instabilities as they cause phantom traffic jams. Right? For example, under normal conditions, I mean when densities are not too high, pedestrians are self-organizing nicely into lanes of one direction, but if the density is too high, crowd disasters may happen, has been observed many times, and people may die even though nobody wants this to happen. We find similarly instabilities of supply chains. This is the beer game. Even if played with managers, they would lose control of the system. And booms and recessions of the world economy is the same thing on a large scale. Nobody wants this to happen, but it happens because people are losing control. Systemic instability is also observed in dynamics of crime. It causes tragedies of the commons, so nobody wants the oceans to be overfished. Nobody wants the global warming to get out of hand. Nobody wants cooperation to break down, but there is an erosion of cooperation and environmental protection and all these kind of things. Conflicts also are often a result of social instabilities. It's easily imaginable if you think about partnerships, right? There are many divorces, and that certainly was not intended when people married. So what happened is that social dynamics set in at some point in time that got out of control. And a similar thing can happen in the relations among countries. Revolutions is another example where the system dynamics gets out of hand. And for example, the GDP per capita exceeds a certain threshold and people want to be more independent. Seems to be also necessary in order to produce that GDP per capita. And economic and social freedoms are becoming essential. like it, huh? This is a nice experiment for a rainy weekend, I should say. But if it happens in reality, this is not nice at all. It can be causing a blackout of the power grid. It can also cause basically a financial crisis around the globe, as this beautiful movie by Frank Schweitzer and his colleagues shows. So Lehman Brothers got bankrupt, and as a result, hundreds of other banks also went bankrupt and caused losses of hundreds of billions of dollars. That, of course, shouldn't happen, right? Now, of course, we are now living in a time of big data. And the question is, will big data save the world? Bruce Anderson, back in 2008, suggested if we just had enough data, quantity of data would turn into quality of data, and the data would basically tell us what we have to do. We would just have to do it. Big data as a benevolent dictator. And he even said that it makes the scientific method obsolete, so you would be unemployed, in other words, right? So what are you doing here? Now the question is, are we getting there? If you ask Google, then they would say yes. They have now AlphaZero. This is an AI system that teaches itself how to play chess or Go, and within just a few hours basically beats not only the best chess player in the world, but also the best computer program that we had before. And now it's being suggested that machine learning would basically also be able to predict chaos. But I should say that the title is pretty misleading. They managed to improve the time period over which they could predict the development of the system, and probably by taking into account implicit correlation within the system, but they cannot predict behavior to infinity. So this is just not possible in chaotic systems. Now the bad news really got out in this letter back in 2012, where it was shown that extracting dynamical equations from experimental data is NP hard. And that means it's computationally not efficient, not feasible. So we are living, of course, in this time of big data where you can take decisions in an evidence-based way. We have an exponential explosion of processing power. Data volume increases even faster, doubles every 12 months. That means within just 1 year we produce as much data as in all the years of human history before. But still, this is not enough in order to control the world in a top-down way. Because systemic complexity increases even faster, namely in a combinatorial way, which is basically a factorial function, and that is even faster than exponential. So, what to do then? Basically, we need to have a different control approach, a distributed control approach, and that leads us eventually to self-organizing systems. So let's have a look at some concrete examples. Can we understand and manage complex systems, and if so, how? I'm starting with pedestrians. So pedestrians have been modeled in analogy to physics through a social force model. So that means we have an equation of motion for pedestrian alpha. It basically says that change of location with time is given by the speed. Then the question is, how does the speed change with time? So what's the acceleration equation? Here we assume it's given by a superposition of different forces. So for example, a driving force that describes the acceleration of the pedestrian towards a desired speed and desired direction of motion takes some time. Would be interactions between pedestrians alpha and beta In many cases, repulsive interactions, but among friends and tourists, it could also be attractive effects. And there would be repulsive effects of walls and streets and so on, and the random force that I haven't shown over here. And then, if you use such kind of models, you will find interesting self-organization phenomena. For example, the emergence of lanes in pedestrian counterflows, as you can see over here. It's one of the most cited papers actually in Physical Review E. So you can clearly see that this happens even though here it's assumed that pedestrians don't have a preference for the right-hand side or left-hand side. It's just the relative velocity that creates more frequent interactions between oppositely moving pedestrians, and they have to step aside, and that separates the flow directions. But that's not the only interesting collective phenomenon that occurs by self-organization. There's also this oscillation of flows at bottlenecks, as we can find it over here. And it looks a little bit as if there was a traffic light or a policeman controlling this, but it's not. The only thing that happens here is on the side where pedestrians have to wait, the pressure is building up and it stops the flow from the other side, and then the flow turns and goes back and forth by itself. It's all based on self-organization. And one phenomenon that excites me even more than this is stripe formation. This is a situation where people try to walk through a stream of pedestrians. They have to cross it, and the stream of pedestrians is like a wall almost. And how could you cross that flow without stopping? If you would have to come up with a solution, it would probably take quite some time, but this is what happens. So basically, there is this stripe formation, a generalization of the lane formation, and people are walking forward within the stripe, with the stripes, and they're walking sideways within the stripes, and this allows them to cross the flow without even stopping. I find this pretty amazing. People don't even have to think about it, it just happens. And then with the social force model, we have basically checked whether we can describe phenomena in real life well, because then such kind of models could be used for planning purposes. So the tricky thing is to get the movement around corners right. If everyone would just want to go over here, then there would be a traffic jam at the corner, and of course this doesn't necessarily happen. Then we need to be able to handle complex environments, right, with many rooms and with corridors. We would even have to handle multi-floor buildings, such as hotels. If you want to simulate an evacuation, for example, then this is essential. And then another thing that matters is route choice. So if there are two opportunities to get to the other side, then the question is how do people behave? And we'll see over here, there's a bottleneck, so people queue up at the bottleneck. And nobody seems to notice that it would be faster actually to walk around this obstacle over there, and that's pretty unrealistic. Right? People are smarter than that, so they're not just heading forward, they're also scanning their environment. It really takes a long time until somebody actually starts taking this up. And so to make it more realistic, you need to have a route choice model built in. And this can of course be done and has been done. So here you can see an improved simulation where people early on would take the other route as well. Right? Once we have done all these things, you can start basically simulating complex environments such as urban areas. Hopefully this is working. So this is the center of Dresden, and we were at that time simulating 30,000 pedestrians in a hypothetical scenario. And in the meantime, we can simulate many more people on a computer. So over here you can see how things scale. It's almost linear if you overlay a grid and only take into account pedestrians in the neighborhood and not pedestrians in any arbitrary place. Because otherwise we would have a square dependence, and then things would slow down dramatically. Now, in fact, in the meantime, there are simulation tools using such kind of models, and they're simulating quite complex scenarios with multimode traffic, so public transport, pedestrians, buses, cars, trams, logistics, airports, and so on and so on. And it's been used also to plan mass events. It can also be used to improve pedestrian facilities. Now, pedestrian facilities are typically made up of those elements over here. And it means you would have corridors, you would have bottlenecks, you would have intersections. And it turns out all those elements are wrongly assigned. If you understand self-organization of pedestrians, then these would be the right designs. It can be easily understood over here, where cutting away the corners would create a funnel, and then the flow would be much smoother, as you can easily imagine, right? But this basically tells you that less can be more. Taking away space can make things more efficient. Once we have understood that, you would start thinking, oh, can't we take away space over here to make the flow in the corridor more efficient? And it turns out actually that putting some pillars in the way would stabilize the lanes and would also be flexible. So here's a movie from Budapest. At the beginning, everyone is walking towards us, then a subway train arrives, people want to go that way, and after some time, people walking into this direction are on the right-hand side, people walking into this direction, I mean towards us, are walking on the left-hand side, so there's a self-organized coordination going on. And then similarly, you can think about intersections. The point is, if you place an obstacle into the middle of the intersection, it would improve the flow as well. And we were pretty surprised by this, and we wouldn't understand it for a long time. But then we realized there were actually a number of different collective patterns of motion that were possible. So for example, clockwise flow, counterclockwise flow, or oscillations where people would walk these ways and the others had to wait, and then he would turn and people would walk those ways and the others would have to wait. So there are many different collective patterns of motion, and they compete with each other, they destroy each other, and as a result we have a pretty chaotic movement in these intersection areas. And there are three, four directions of motion crossing each other. And if you put such an obstacle in the center, then basically you make those oscillatory modes less likely, while it doesn't obstruct the rotary modes. But there's still two rotary modes. So in order to select one of them, you could put such rails into the system, considering also that people have a preference in most countries to walk on the right-hand side. Japan, by the way, on the left-hand side, so you would have to adjust it to the country. And of course, you could apply evolutionary optimization in order to improve layouts of pedestrian facilities. So you would start with an original layout, you would multiply it, you would change it randomly, and then you would test it. You would check how efficient these simulation outcomes are. So there are different kind of measures for efficiency and comfort and so on. And then you select the better solutions, you multiply them again, you go through the cycles many times until you have a good solution. So for example, if you start with such a situation with a room in a corridor, that means a bottleneck, then what happens is this. So in the beginning, through random mutation, some very stupid designs are being created, but eventually very reasonable designs are created. It means now we have a funnel-shaped solution, and it's convex, so, and that's what came out of the evolutionary optimization. And the other thing is, if people would actually push in an evacuation situation where there's a bottleneck, then you would even get some more interesting solutions. For example, these asymmetric design or the zigzag design shown over here. Do you have any idea why this is a better design? Well, basically it protects the people standing over here and trying to get out of the room from the pressure of pushing people from behind. Right? That pressure will be absorbed by the wall over here or by the zigzag design. So there will be less pressure on those people at the door, and they can leave more easily. And so basically football stadiums should also be designed in different ways. Okay, so much on pedestrians. What about freeway traffic? So people would ask, is traffic predictable? And then if you look at empirical examples such as these, then you say, oh my God, I will never be able to describe this in a quantitative way. Now, unfortunately, I did my traffic research before data became available. So we had theoretical models, and then when we got access to data, turned out things are actually more complex than the traffic community saw at that time. And then I couldn't change the field anymore. It was a matter of honor really to show that we could understand this. And we made it. So basically what we did is we worked a little bit like in elementary particle physics. We were thinking, can we cut down these complex patterns into elementary patterns that can be understood? And then can we understand the composition of those elementary patterns? And the answer is yes. So by now there is traffic physics, and there's an analytical theory of traffic flow which describes the main observations in traffic flows, and I think this is a big success. But things are quite counterintuitive. So take a freeway with an on-ramp, as shown over here. On-ramp is at kilometer 0. So we're assuming a scenario where we can have free flow. Obviously the density is slightly higher downstream of the on-ramp. Now what we do is we reduce the density for some time. You will see, oh, that's perfect, traffic will flow even more smoothly. And it turns out no. So what happens is this reduction of density creates a pattern that moves forward in the beginning with the cars. But eventually it turns around. We call that the boomerang effect. So a traffic jam is formed. When cars are stopped in a traffic jam, cars are flowing out, and the at the front of the traffic jam, and news are joining the traffic jam from behind it. That means the traffic jam is moving upstream, as we saw it actually in the movie before. So it has to turn around if there is the formation of a traffic jam. That's the boomerang effect. Then it gets back to the location of the on-ramp, and suddenly traffic flow breaks down. That means there's not anymore the same capacity. This very same freeway can handle less traffic now. We call that capacity drop. And also we see this oscillation that is forming over here. So there are many things going on in this plot, and all of them needs to be understood. And they can be understood actually with models like these. The intelligent driver model, IDM, and it's basically made up of a few equations, not very complicated. So there's again its weight and equation of motion, and there's an acceleration equation, and that acceleration equation depends on the distance, speed, and relative velocity of subsequent vehicles. So it's a car following model, and it's accident free if they start with reasonable distances from each other. And then you can simulate different kinds of traffic states in a system where we have a freeway and an on-ramp where cars are entering. And then depending on how much cars are flowing into the system, you would get either free traffic flow or one of those patterns over here. So moving localized clusters, paint localized clusters, this traffic jam suddenly stops, actually at the location of the on-ramp. Stop and go waves, oscillating congested traffic, homogeneous congested traffic. Quite surprising that a simple model with I think 3 parameters is describing 5 different congested traffic states in a very simple setup. And then the question is, does it describe what we observed empirically? And here are actually the empirical elementary traffic states that we observed, and qualitatively it looks quite similar, even though the match is not perfect. Also because here things are more complicated. For example, there's cars and trucks, right? We didn't take this into account. Of course, we can do that, and we've done that, but I want to keep things simple over here. Now, then you would get interested to ask, under what conditions do we find those different congestion states? And you would come up with a so-called phase diagram that tells you what traffic state occurs for certain flow conditions. So that's the upstream flow, upstream of the on-ramp. This is the ramp flow, or bottleneck strength, as we sometimes call it. The sum of both, that means along the diagonal lines, it's the downstream traffic flow, the traffic volume, basically. So as you increase the traffic volume, you go from free traffic to congested traffic. Makes a lot of sense. And then you would have stop and go waves and homogeneous congested traffic separated from each other. Another thing that you observe is that things depend on the size of the perturbations in the traffic flow. You have a small perturbation, you get this. You have large perturbation, you have this. That means there's history dependence, hysteresis. It means for the same flow conditions, you could have free traffic flow, but you could also have congestion. So it's highly interesting what happens. You had no idea when you made your driver's license that you were doing this, but you're doing it. And then the question is, how well does it describe actually what we observe empirically? So this is the data. And you can find there's a clear pattern. Here we have the moving localized cluster, we have pinned localized clusters over here, stop and go, traffic, oscillating congested traffic, and the homogeneous congested traffic over there. well separated from each other, and it fits actually the theoretical predictions quite well. We're that far that we can basically predict the extension of traffic jams and also the delay times with traffic models, as you can see over here. So white line is prediction, and the colorful part is what we observe empirically. One of the interesting things also that we observed is what you call the boomerang effect. I mentioned it already before, so we found that many times actually in our empirical data, and we saw what's actually going on here. And then we looked in more detail into the data, and we found this. So this is the freeway, this is the flow direction, and these are basically the dips over here. Is the congestion. So things flow like this, and then suddenly traffic breaks down and things flow like that. And you can see a line over here, which is the front of that platoon of vehicles that's forming initially. Do you have any idea what is the speed of this line, propagation speed? When we were measuring it, we said, oh, yes, of course, this is the reason why we have so many of these boomerang effects. It's 80 kilometers an hour. These are trucks overtaking each other. And cars are basically queuing up behind the trucks. So that means that platoon behind the trucks is growing, and eventually over here people are trying to get out of the freeway, and additional perturbation occurs, and that then triggers basically the formation of the traffic jam. So one way basically to reduce congestion would be to say at certain times of the day trucks shouldn't overtake each other. So basically what you want to do to reduce congestion is to reduce perturbations in the traffic flow, because those trigger the breakdown. Breakdown means capacity drop. You're losing capacity of your freeway exactly at the time when you need the capacity most, during the rush hour. So you want to delay the breakdown as much as possible. Once the breakdown is there, travel times multiply. Even small reductions in capacity would create multiple travel times. So you would try to smoothen out traffic flow. How can you do that? You can do that with driver assistance systems, adaptive cruise control systems. And we've been working on this actually long before people have been talking about self-driving cars. And we're talking here not just about increasing comfort and having one single car drive autonomously. You're talking here about creating a collective dynamic that dissolves traffic jams. I'm not sure who has ever thought about that. So it was clear that cars would become smarter, that would have perceptions through sensors that could start to communicate with each other through inter-vehicle communication, that they would cooperatively be able to determine the traffic state. That would be something like cognition, and then there would be decision making too. So cars would decide what had to be done and change their behavior depending on the traffic state. And it was not only theoretical developed, it was also put into cars and tested and worked pretty well. And different kinds of data had to be fused together, and we figured out that there were different traffic situations that had to be distinguished, and dependent on where you were, for example, outside of a traffic jam, in the traffic jam, about to enter the traffic jam or about to exit the traffic jam, you would have to choose the parameters in this intelligent driver model that's basically behind the adaptive cruise control. You would have to choose the parameters differently in order to avoid accidents, in order to make cars accelerate out of the traffic jam, in order to increase capacity. And you can see over here, it works not only if all the cars are equipped with that technology, basically a radar sensor that measures the distance and relative velocity, and then lets the car drive autonomously, slightly differently from humans. It works also if there's only a certain percentage of cars using that technology. That makes it interesting for the market entrants. So you can see that would be the congestion pattern without the adaptive cruise control. This with 10% equipped vehicles, this with 20% equipped vehicles. So traffic jam basically goes away. Highly effective with a small equipment rate. A huge effect on travel times. And here you can see a simulation, nicely done by Martin Driver in Dresden. So we are basically now simulating those equations I showed you before. It illustrates you that we can understand and simulate the stop-and-go traffic that we often experience more or less every day. Now we get annoyed about the terrible traffic jam, so we take a helicopter, and that's why we can see what's the reason for the traffic jam. And so basically here are a few cars that want to get into the freeway. That creates a small disruption in the traffic flow. It's being amplified, it causes a stop-and-go traffic. Now, in a few seconds, we'll turn on the adaptive cruise control, which is actually a traffic assistance system. So it will stabilize the traffic flow and slightly increase the capacity. And even though the same number of vehicles per hour is still entering the freeway, you see the traffic jam has been dissolved without extra road capacity, just by better coordination. So we call this mechanism design. It doesn't require a traffic center, no benevolent dictator, no centralized control, just changing the interactions. By changing the interaction, it changes the outcome of this optimization. So the trick is basically you have real-time data and real-time feedback that changes the interactions in a desirable way. Now the question is, can that also be done for urban traffic flows, where there's even more congestion? And the answer is yes. That's the situation today. It doesn't have to be like this. And I think I'm skipping this because it will come later on again. And so today, of course, we have traffic control centers that try to get as much information as possible and to come up with an optimal control scheme for traffic lights. But traffic light optimization is an NP-hard optimization problem. It cannot be solved in real time, even for medium-sized cities, even with supercomputers. So you have to make simplifications. And then what they do is they come up offline with an optimal schedule and impose it on the city and adapt it a little bit. But it's basically based on a periodic operation for a typical traffic flow, which however never occurs. The average is not representative for what is really happening in the system. So we say, forget about all this, let's redo traffic control and be inspired by the self-organization of pedestrian flows at bottlenecks, because intersections are also bottlenecks, just for more flow directions. We were asking ourselves, couldn't we introduce a pressure principle that would create self-organized oscillations that would allow us to define a traffic light control. So basically, we came up with a traffic light control where the traffic flows were controlling the traffic lights rather than the other way around, a bottom-up control. And I will now show that this actually works better, even though it's really hard to believe. So let's compare 3 different ways of controlling traffic lights. This is a traffic control center in our group. I talked about it, right? So the idea is get as much information as possible, try to do the best thing, impose it, even though it's not democratic at all. That's the benevolent dictatorship idea. Many people like it, in particular politicians, business bosses, and all this. That is a different approach over here in the middle, where we say, let's take a decentralized approach where every intersection decides autonomously based on the vehicles that are coming in on that road section towards that intersection, and then have every intersection strictly minimize travel times. I will give you a mathematical formula and it can be done exactly. And so it's like Homo economicus. Everyone tries to do the best thing locally, but no coordination with anyone else. Okay, and we would think cannot work as well as this because there is no coordination. But who knows? This is working similar to this, but if there is a queue of vehicles that grows large, we would first dissolve the queue before we go back to travel time minimization. So we pay attention to our neighbors. We're friendly to our neighbors, which is perhaps not good for us, for the focal intersection. So one would intuitively think centralized control should be the best, that's the second best, and that's the worst thing we can do. Okay, let's see what really happens. Now look at the red line over here. You can see as the capacity utilization of the intersection increases, the queue length increases too. And that makes a lot of sense. So more or less a linear increase of the queue length with capacity utilization. Yeah? All right. We didn't expect anything else. But let's have a look at this selfish optimization Homo economicus approach, right? Decentralized, and hey, it's working much better over here, right? Much shorter queue lengths. Why is this? Because we don't have a periodic operation anymore. Whenever there is a car coming towards the intersection, we'll just turn green for the car. Doesn't have to wait. And so it works well, and suddenly there's an explosion of the queue lengths, and basically what we can say is Adam Smith's invisible hand works well over here, and it fails over there. And the traffic control center says, ha! This is why you pay us millions every year, because you need us in order to coordinate traffic flow when there's large traffic volume. Right? But that's not the end of the story, because there's our third approach, and turns out it's better all the way. I mean, locally optimizing, but paying some attention to your neighbors. So we can make the invisible hand work if you just have the right kind of local interactions. And actually it works really nicely. It produces self-organized green waves, and it works not only for this Manhattan cities, but also for real complex cities such as the city center of Dresden. And now it looks really messy, like any historical town center. There's a train station over here. You can see some roads. Totally irregular, what makes it even worse. There are a lot of buses and trams that cut through this, and you'd like to prioritize public transportation. But if you do that, basically, the green wave created by the traffic control system that they had, and they had a competition for the best system, and then it chose the best one and paid millions for it, and it creates green waves, and it also is even adaptive to the traffic flow. But if you prioritize public transport, it will cut through the green waves, will destroy the green waves, will have a monster traffic jam within minutes. So you can either do something good for public transport or do something good for cars. In this case, cars won, because otherwise really the entire city would suffer of congestion. And they said, okay, so we have a good solution for many parts of the cities, but we don't manage to get this sorted out. You can have it. And the worst of the worst. And then we were working with the same data that was used to set up the state-of-the-art control that they're currently using. And you can see over here is creating those green waves. But it's a pretty rigid pattern, while we have a flexible pattern that actually uses gaps in the traffic flow that occur by themselves as opportunities and adjusts to those opportunities and uses them. And now the question is, what is better? This looks more well organized. Better, yeah. But what is better? So it turns out a self-organized, decentralized approach can outsmart centralized control a lot. So public transport is gaining a lot, but not at the cost of individualized traffic. Pedestrians and cyclists are gaining a lot. It's also good for the environment. It's a totally new approach for a complex optimization problem. Bottom-up coordination outcompetes our classical approaches. So, can we use that also in other kinds of systems? For example, logistics and supply chains. I told you about the beer game. I told you about booms and recessions. We have this financial crisis since 2008. Many countries are still suffering. They haven't recovered really. So, it turns out you can basically represent material flows in supply networks through a certain kind of mathematics, or input-output matrices in particular. But you want to take into account the dynamics. And so the idea is that all the companies, all the sectors of the economy are trying to adjust to changes in demand. There's a delay until you have adjusted. And this can actually lead to different kinds of patterns. And these are the different patterns that can occur. So there can be damped oscillations, there can be an overdamped behavior, that's what we'd like to have, and there can also be growing oscillations. And then the question is, what happens if you plug in a real input-output matrix of the world economy, and it turns out that you get this. Booms and recessions, but not in a cyclical way as kind of classical economics models would predict, but with this irregularity that's quite typical actually for the booms and recessions. So we can now understand it as a result of supply network dynamics. Next thing that you could ask is, can we actually stabilize the system? And that's compare different organizations of supply chain. So we could have just this over here, and it gives you this. So basically, small perturbations, again, will amplify and will get large oscillations actually in production. Or you can do this, or you can do this. So if you do this, you get that, and if you do that, you get this. So basically, this design is dampening the oscillations. So here you have a pretty stable system. Now then, if you compare this with what Intel is doing, that is their supply chain, how they're organized, and it looks more or less as we just figured it out to stabilize production. So yes, we could stabilize production in the world. And then one day we had a phone call, and they said, oh, we've been reading about your pedestrian work and we found it interesting. Maybe you can help us with our production plan, because there we have congestion many times. It's not good for our profit. So I said, okay, can you show me the situation? I went there, I had to look at this. We represented the factory layout in an abstract way. You can see here different machines over here. There's this is basically a paper box producing factory. So you start with a corrugator, and then there's a buffer, and there are different post-processing in order to get the boxes done, right? And what happened is the corrugator basically broke down easily. So whenever they had it fixed, they ran it as quickly as they could, because they said, let's get done as much as possible until it breaks down again. And that caused basically congestion in the buffer. So the problem, it turned out, they had many engineers, who learned all this stuff, but they didn't have the complexity thinking. The problem was not the corrugator that broke down all the time, as they thought. The problem was that they were pushing things too quickly into the buffer. The buffer was the bottleneck. And then you have very similar dynamics actually as on freeway. So basically, a bottleneck develops, missing quantities grow downstream, gems propagate upstream, and you have a mess everywhere in your factory. And we started then to represent this in a mathematical way and to implement it in a computer program. So you can see it's being abstracted, and then it's being simulated eventually. And we came up with an agent-based factory simulator of self-organized production plans. So basically we're saying, okay, let's model every single element, and let's make sure that we can combine those elements in our computer simulation, and then you can basically move it around, right, with an evolutionary optimization, and basically put it together in different ways and have your computer program figure out optimal factory layouts. And we're also thinking about, oh, maybe we can create an intelligent factory. That was before the time when people talked a lot about smart everything, So the idea was that the packages could basically talk to the machines and tell them what had to be done with them. And they could talk to the other packages and say, hey, I'm actually quite late, can you let me overtake, please? And all these kind of things. Just need some sensors and some intelligent technology, and that can now be built. Now it's easy, but at the time it was barely possible. But now packages could be intelligent in a sense, a little bit at least. So you can come up with self-organizing production, right? Where the packages figure out maybe an alternative way through the production plant. And here is an example by Kai Foreman, so you can see when there's not so much production and basically the packages take the shortest path. And then the more you feed into the system, a different mode of organization needs to come up, and basically what you get is a counterclockwise operation of this very same buffer system, all based on self-organization, right? And so, yeah, the final idea here was, let's have self-organizing factories, where you may even move machines around in the future. Okay, so there's some papers on this in case you're interested in agent-based approach to self-organized production, self-organizing principles in supply networks and production systems, self-regulating supply-demand systems, and so on. And there can be quite surprising effects. We did that when I was in Dresden, and they had Infineon Technologies, and Infineon Technologies produces silicon wafers, chips, in other words. And they had so-called wet benches where they have chemical bases to etch out structures in the silicon wafers. And the point is, you can put the silicon wafer for a minimum time. You have to put it for a minimum time into the chemical bath. Otherwise, the structure doesn't come out well. If you put it too long, quality will be poor, so you can throw it away. Each chemical has a different bathing time. And you have one grid bar which moves around those different benches of the silicon wafers. And they just didn't get it up to the capacity that the producer of that machine promised them. And the producer apparently couldn't fix it, whatever. And what they were trying to do is to have a minimum passing time in order to maximize the throughput. That's what I thought. But what then happened was there was a conflict of requests for the cribber that should be moving everything around. We said, slow down, relax. Slower is faster, so we made sure to extend the processes in a way that avoided conflicts of requests for the cribber. And see, we could increase the capacity by more than 30%. It was just a diploma or master's thesis. Then we were asked to come to a harbor. And they said, look, we have these automated guided vehicles that basically move around the containers in our harbor space, from the ships to the storage space and back and all this, but they're standing in each other's ways. We said, slow it down. Because you need to have a safety distance between those automated guided vehicles, and that increases quadratically with the speed. So the faster they go, the more space you need to have in between those different automatic guided vehicles. So if you slow them down, then there's more runtime, so it takes longer for them to move, but there's much less waiting time, and altogether your system will be more efficient. So that's the slower is faster effect.